So good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here for this very important public event, which is taking place at such a deeply, deeply troubling time in our nation. During a presidential campaign that has, across the country, unfurled unprecedented levels of divisive, bigoted, angry, violent, and immoral language about many, as was shown so starkly in last night's attack, questioning the fundamental humanity of our immigrant brothers and sisters. These are perilous days, and the very democratic future of our nation is being put at risk. It is my great honor to welcome back to Union the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, as well as so many of these respected leaders from religious communities around the country. As many of you know, we are thrilled that Dr. Barber is presently a visiting professor of public theology and activism at Union. We are so glad to have him as part of the Union family. Dr. Barber is also the president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach. He is the pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, a fellow at Auburn Seminary, the founding energy behind the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina. The list goes on and on. But let me add that most importantly, he is a well-known minister, pastor, prophet, activist to countless grassroots and community organizations across our nation. He brings people together to work towards creating moral and decent ways of being together. And I know from experience that in his own being, he embodies that moral goodness. I also want to put my own vote in here and say that I think Dr. Barber gave what was one of the most powerful and much-needed speeches in recent years at the Democratic National Convention. Amen. When he called for a moral resuscitation of a nation in the throes of a deadly respiratory arrest. I'm thankful that Dr. Barber has chosen to convene this gathering here at Union because we are an institution that is deeply committed to rigorous scholarship, social justice, and spiritual leadership. And this morning's event, in so many ways, embodies our motto: Union is a place where faith and scholarship meet to reimagine the work of social justice. So now, the Reverend Dr. William Barber.
Cut it off? I think. It's good to be here with all of my friends, as if I was in the Old Testament, I would say the troublers of Israel. I rushed out from Louisville, Kentucky, and actually left my suit coat, but my friend said, come on, because we still have work to do. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for allowing us to be here at Union and to be with the students and so many people who are so clear in their moral critique in this era. I also have to say I am so grateful to be traveling the country with Dr. James, Jim Forbes, and Liz Theo Harris, and Tracy Blackman, and Sister Simone Campbell, as we're traveling to more than 25 states with the revival, Time for a Moral Revolution of Values. And that's why we were in Kentucky just last evening planning for a gathering there. I want to talk for a moment and then have all of my friends and colleagues to speak to this issue. And I want to frame it around this theme: African Americans, poor whites, and Latinos know what America has to lose. So in recent days, we've heard this. If you're an African American, Mr. Trump says he wants your vote. Democrats have taken us for granted, he said, speaking in overwhelmingly white communities. Today, we don't want to endorse one way or the other, but we want to critique this construct. According to him, black citizens have been gullible, unsophisticated in the way we have cast our votes. He doesn't see us among his audiences, but he hopes we are listening, and he promises that he and he alone can fix our problems. After all, he raises the question, what the hell do you have to lose? As scholars and theologians, our question is this construct for addressing something as serious as systemic racism helpful? Does it move us forward? Is it even accurate or truthful? Well, we believe it is not helpful. It is not accurate, no matter who says it or promotes it, because it's not just one person. It's a kind of mythology that exists in our culture, and it surely does not move our democracy forward. Black Americans and our allies, whites and Jews and others, have had to fight for every civil liberty and legal protection we've gained since arriving on these shores as chattel slaves. Wherever and whenever we won the right to vote, we became the most sophisticated voters, knowing that no party or candidate is perfect. But our history has given us heavy burdens, but it has also granted us irrevocable insights. We know perhaps better than any group of Americans how much we all lose if we buy an oversimplistic, opportunistic lie to address the continuing challenges of racism and classism. For we know better than anyone that racism is not about so much what's in your heart, but what's in the heart of your policies that you support. We see this clearly just yesterday, in the last few weeks, when 2 cases in North Carolina concluded that the Republican leadership in our state and governor engaged in intentional racism, despite the fact that the governor never said a racist word that we know of, never stood up and used ugly, blatant language. But when the courts examined the policies at the heart, the court concluded unanimously, and the Supreme Court upheld it yesterday, that it was intentional racism. So as scholars and theologians who are called to do justice, love mercy, and speak in the public square with a truthful critique, I want to raise some issues now. First, after a year of racially charged speeches and regressive policy proposal, masterfully fanning white fear, Mr. Trump wants to convince us he's not a racist. George Wallace did a similar thing in 1968 in his presidential campaign, which followed the 1964 race-baiting campaign of Republican nominee Barry Goldwater. Wallace, who had declared just 5 years earlier segregation yesterday, today, and forever, tried to pivot away from the stigma of Old South bigotry, using the language of anti-elitism, anti-communism, and law and order to win white voters reeling with fear and hatred of the Black freedom movement, the anti-war movement, the counterculture, and the women's liberation movement. Even as he was still proposing policies that were racially discriminatory, Wallace said with somewhat of a straight face, right here in Madison Square Garden, "My wife received more black votes in Alabama than did either of her opponents, and we are proud to say that they support us now in this race for the presidency, and we would like to have the support of people of all races, colors, creeds, religion, and national origin," even as his policies were still rooted in segregation and bigotry. To win the White House in '68, Richard Nixon learned to out-Wallace Wallace by speaking in a new racially coded language that capitalized on racial fears and prejudices, without using blatant slurs and open appeals to white supremacy. He racialized entitlement programs. He talked about law and order, being against forced busing. He talked about tax cuts. Lee Atwater, one of the architects of Nixon's campaign, called this the Southern Strategy. A brilliant campaign. And he said it was a blueprint for everything he did in the South since. Nixon used this Southern strategy to establish a new Sunbelt power base for the Republican Party in the South and West. Many Southern white conservatives, Jesse Helms, Strom Thurmond, and most of what would become the new so-called right in the South left the Democratic Party. Strom Thurmond organized conservative Democrats across the South to abandon their party and become Republicans in 1968, telling them that Nixon could actually win and that the white South would never go back to the party of civil rights. Nixon took the entire South except for 5 states that Wallace took, and his narrow victory in 1968 would have been a landslide except for that. Now, using this strategy, this way of talking about race, by 1969, because of this deliberate propaganda, most middle-class whites believed blacks had a better chance at good education, jobs, and housing than they did, and almost 80% said that most people on welfare could earn their own way if they wanted to. Kevin Phillips, who was the architect of the Southern strategy, explained in a book, all you have to do with American politics is work out who hates who. Phillips advised Nixon that the Republican Party could win without Negro votes by painting the Democrats as the black party. He knew if they could control the South, they could control 22 U.S. Senate seats, 31% of the U.S. House of Representatives, and 160-plus electoral votes by just controlling 13 states using this kind of strategy and propaganda. He predicted a new American revolution coming out of the South and the West. Phillips noted that white ethnics in the North were also ripe for the picking, correctly predicting, for example, that the Irish Democrats in New York would turn Republican because they don't like the Jews and the Negroes who run the New York Democratic Party. That's a quote from Phillips. The South, Phillips said, would become a stronghold of a new Republican Party. This started in 1968 and culminated in Ronald Reagan's 1980 Southern sweep in a campaign he launched in Philadelphia, Mississippi, famous for only one thing, the murder of 3 civil rights workers in 1964, where he gave a speech on states' rights, spoke against the Voting Rights Act, used coded language to describe poor welfare queens and strapping young bucks who were gaming the system. When you know this history, you are able to say to Mr. Trump and anyone else that when you attempt to address racism in a way that's opportunistic, regressive, and untruthful, we know what's going on. And you then can understand why people will often do this, as was done recently by Mr. Trump, beginning this conversation in North Carolina and Mississippi in almost all white audiences. The core of the strategy has been to court whites resentful and fearful of minorities, and now some want to claim that we're the party of Lincoln. But Lincoln's Republican Party and its opposition Democratic Party were the polar opposite of today's parties that carried the same names. If persons wanted to embrace the party of Lincoln, they would have to embrace Reconstruction policies that won free black support in the 19th century. They would have to be for federal intervention to ensure equal protection, for expanding voting rights, for public education, for restoring the Voting Rights Act. African Americans are not naive. We know when Trump or any other extremists do not represent the party of Lincoln because they oppose the policies that have increased our freedom and our well-being in this nation. Furthermore, when Mr. Trump or his surrogates say that Republicans passed the civil rights laws and Democrats didn't help, that type of revisionist history is not healthy for our republic. It helps to maintain many historical myths which continue to inform far too many in divisive ways. The truth is, in the U.S. Senate in 1964, the Civil Rights Act passed 73 to 27. Among Democrats, it passed 46 to 21. Among Republicans, 27 to 6. In the Senate, the only Southern Democrat that voted for the Civil Rights Act was Ralph Yarborough of Texas. No other Senate Republican in the Senate voted yes. In the House, 8 Southern Democrats voted for the Civil Rights Act. In the Senate, only 1 Southern Democratic senator voted for it. Not a single Southern Republican senator or representative did. In other words, not a single Southern Republican from either the Senate or the House voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act, while 9 Southern Democrats did. This vote was not about party, it was about region. And we have to know this history. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was sponsored by Senate Minority Leader Everett Dirksen, a Republican, and Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield, a Democrat, and co-sponsored by 46 Democrats and 20 Republicans. It passed in the U.S. House on August 3rd by 328 to 74. Democrats supported it 221 to 61. Republicans supported it 112 to 24, and passed the United States Senate on August 4th. 79 Democrats voted for it, and 49 Republicans voted for it. 30 to 1 was 49 to 17, excuse me, in the Democrats, and 30 to 1 Republicans supported it. And LGBJ signed it on August the 6th. Trump's pivot is a political ploy to taken out of the Southern strategy playbook, used by candidates from Nixon to Reagan to exploit white Southern fear while avoiding the stigma of overt racism. Right. This strategy taught politicians, especially in the South, how to talk race in coded language: tax cuts, entitlement reform, states' rights, right to work, and voter fraud. By associating black political power with big government, the Southern strategy created a disdain for the very social uplift programs that had benefited many whites in the 1940s and 50s. This convinced many whites to vote against their own self-interest, thereby undermining the coalition of poor and working people who had challenged systemic injustice during the labor and civil rights movement. So when we hear Mr. Trump say, "What do you have to lose?" I immediately think of all that African Americans have fought for and won together with our allies. The question itself is an insult to black people in America and justice-thinking people in America. Right. But hear me, it is also an insult to poor whites, because despite the injustices we have faced, there are still more whites that are poor than are of us. According to the University of Michigan National Poverty Center, 26% of African Americans are poor, an extreme disparity that every party has to step up and deal with. 10% poverty among whites. But in real numbers, there are millions more poor whites who are being conned by the Southern strategy and the extremists who use it to build their own power and their own wealth. The worst lie of our time is that extreme policies only hurt black people. In state houses across America, we have seen this kind of political extremism attack voting rights, public education, health care, living wages, labor rights, immigrants' rights. Its trickle-down economics led to the worst recession since the Great Depression, and it hurt whites as well as blacks all across the board. Right. And so, as one writer says out of Duke, the issue we have to wrestle with today is racism without racists, colorblind racism, and the persistence of racial inequality. And Dr. Silver says the main problem nowadays is not folks with hoods, but folks dressed in suits. He also says the new racism, like God, works in mysterious ways and is quite effective in maintaining white privilege. And the mythology that black and brown people are not people with problems, but a problem people. Racism is not just about prejudice. It's about the ability to implement your prejudice in public policy in ways that hurt real people. Now, finally, a grown-up, mature, and serious conversation transformative about race will ask these questions. What is it that causes many whites that are poor, since the census say 18.9 million whites are poor, and that's 8 million more poor white people than black, and 5 million more than Latino? What causes a candidate to only talk about poverty as though it's a black issue? And then what causes many whites, particularly in the South and sometimes in areas of the North, to be against the very programs that uplift the poor? What causes you to be against living wages? What causes you to elect politicians that represent the poorest counties. 97% of the poorest counties in America are represented by so-called red states and politicians that vote against the very programs like living wages, labor rights, and unemployment benefits and earned income tax credit that even Ronald Reagan supported. What is it? What myth has that kind of hold on the American psyche? We need a grown-up conversation. What myth is it that down in the South, where you have the highest rate of uninsured people, black and white, you have the most states denying Medicaid expansion? 24 states, most of them in the South, 8 million people. What is it? What is it that causes people to vote against their own self-interest? John Kasich, a Republican, even said one time that to stand against Medicaid expansion was war on the poor. What is it that makes you stand against programs that helps rural hospitals be saved, that are actually serving construction workers, healthcare workers, farmers, veterans, many of them white? In my state, 500,000 people being denied, 346,000 people are white. And the same people that deny Medicaid expansion are the same people that intentionally engaged in racial discrimination and voter suppression. What is it that makes you think privatizing schools with public money is the way to go? What is it that makes you think that beating up on teachers and somehow if we give all this money to private schools that creates more resegregation and more high poverty schools? What myth is it that doesn't allow you to see how dangerous it is to have a society where police feel they can assassinate people on the spot? And even when you see black and white and Jewish and Muslim people walking together saying Black Lives Matter, somehow you see that as anti-police and not pro-democracy. Right. What is it? What we need is a grown-up conversation about race, not an opportunistic, oversimplified, untruthful, revisionist conversation. If we want to deal with racism, where do you start? With policy. Where do you stand on pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that build up economic democracy through employment, living wages, alleviation of disparate unemployment, a transition away from fossil fuel, labor rights, affordable housing, safety nets, fair policies for immigrants, changing war policies that preempt a real war on poverty? Where do you stand on equality in public education and guarantee that every child has access to a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional public education? Where do you stand on health care for all and eventually universal health care and Social Security and Medicare? Where do you stand on environmental protection and protection of women's health? Where do you stand on respect for all people and all religions, Christians, Jews, Muslims, the Jewish child and the Palestinian child, the Latino, the African, the Asian, the European? Where do you stand on fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing disparities that hurt black, brown, and poor white people? Where do you stand on the proliferation of guns? Where do you stand on protecting and expanding voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, labor rights, religious freedom rights, immigrant rights, and never giving up on the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law? If you want to deal with racism, let's deal with the heart of your policies. And when we know where your treasury is, when we know where your policies are, we'll know where your heart is. Dr. Serene Jones and Union, thank you for allowing us to be here to convene. There's so much wisdom and strength in this room. As Dr. Forbes and I are going across this nation leading the revival, Time for a Moral Revolution of Values, that's it. We had to decide we had to get out of our safe spaces and make them hear you. I want to ask all of the leaders here to join us. We still have about 15 to go. We're headed to Texas in a few weeks. The people are ready. Right. Dr. Forbes, everywhere we go, they are ready for the voices of faith to speak to this present age in a way that's real different, as Jim says, from that limited so-called, I'm an evangelical. I tell people I'm a theologically liberal, conservative, evangelical biblicist. And I'll explain that later at another seminar. And I think about, Dr. Forbes, as we close here today, that text in Ezekiel, before you get to the dry bones, where God asks Ezekiel, he says to Ezekiel, your political leaders have become animalistic in their talk and in their actions. He actually says, Rabbi, they have become like wolves. He that literally describes and he says because they are dividing people, they're hurting the poor, they're hurting the widows, they're hurting the least of these. Then God flips the question, not so much on them, but can I find somebody to stand in the gap? They're going to do what they do, but is there anyone that will stand in the gap and that will go and speak hope to the people so that the people will rise up as a mighty army of justice? Three things, hopefully, that you gather from here. And, excuse me, by the way, go to www.moralrevival.org if you're interested in the moral revival. On September the 12th, we're going to announce next week on the 6th, we're having gatherings, getting in the public square, outside of the sanctuary. Hope all of you in 25 states across this country. Last three things. We have to deal with racism, classism, but it can't be from the perspective of a simplistic, opportunistic, revisionist attitude that is untruthful and full of dangerous myths. Can't be that. Number two, we have to be concerned about rhetoric, but in two languages. As my Pentecostal friend, we got to learn to speak in tongues. Because some of the language is coded and some of it is blatant, but all of it's bad.
Right.
For instance, the current leadership of our United States Congress has never openly used the language of Trumpism. That's really what they're mad about, is how he's saying stuff you're not supposed to say in public.
Right, right.
Not necessarily the policies are bad, because they're saying Ryan has never said some of those things. He's very smooth. McConnell is smooth. But that same Congress, in the time in which we are facing intentional racism and voter suppression, have blocked restoring the Voting Rights Act for more than 1,100 days, which is 1,099 days longer than Strom Thurmond filibustered the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And they've done it cool, calm, and collected, but it's still racism.
Right.
And then the third thing, a true commitment to deal with racism has to come from an examination of policy. It's not about what Abraham Lincoln did. You can't claim, well, Abraham Lincoln's dead. And we had to challenge him too, if you deal with history right.
Thank you.
What are you doing? Where is your treasure? That's where your heart is. No matter how much you say you want to help me or deal with racism, Jesus once said, you say, Lord, Lord, with your mouth, but your heart is far from me. If the heart of your policies are far from the things that deal with eradicating injustice, then no matter what you say with your mouth, I'm going to help the African Americans. We want them. It's the policy. And so I say to the media, oftentimes media, I heard it the other night, I think on CNN somewhere, you asked the wrong question. Do you think a person, are they racist in their heart? Wrong question. Look at the heart of the policy. And if the heart of the policy has a disparate impact on black people and brown people and Muslims and gay people, if the heart of the policy, then, and it's either one way, either you're ignorant to it, but you're still engaged in disparate impact, which is still illegal and morally wrong, or if you're conscious of it, then that tells what you are. If you know the policy is having a racially disparate impact and you still promote it, don't look at what's in your heart. Do a policy examination and you'll find out.